Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. Tonight we're going back into the land of Ooh, but we're taking a different path down than usual. Most explorations of this show's depths go straight for the Mushroom War and the Lich and the Ice King's crown, and they're right to, because that's the deepest and oldest scar in the whole world. But there's another iceberg sitting right next to that one, and almost nobody talks about it the same way. This one is made of the things the show built later, in its final 3 years, when the writers knew the end was coming and decided to spend that time cutting open every character they'd been circling for a decade. This is the iceberg of the miniseries era: the vampire wars, the human colonies, the elemental apocalypse, the boy made of grass, and the war between two sisters that ended everything. Some of it is stranger than the mythology you already know. All of it is true, in the sense that it happened on screen. And I'll tell you plainly whenever we're standing on soft ground instead of solid rock. Let's go down. The place to start isn't inside the show at all, and I want to say plainly, up front, that almost nothing in the next couple of hours will retread ground you've probably already heard covered elsewhere. The Mushroom War, the crown, the Lich waiting inside a snail. We're staying down in the corners most people skip past entirely. It's in a hallway at Cartoon Network sometime in early 2014, during the production of the show's 5th season, when Pendleton Ward, the man who had drawn Finn and Jake for the first time on a napkin or a sketchbook page years before any of this existed, quietly stepped down as showrunner. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't do a press tour about it. People noticed because a different name started showing up in the credits doing the job he used to do, and that name was Adam Muto, a friend of Ward's from Cal Arts, who had been storyboarding on the show since its earliest days. It took Ward himself a while to explain what had happened, and when he finally did, in an interview with Rolling Stone, he said something that a lot of creative people recognize immediately, even if they've never run a television show. He said dealing with people every day wears on you. He said it takes energy and time. You don't have to make something worth making, something that's actually good, and that the show had become a beast. He hadn't expected it to run 5 seasons. He definitely hadn't expected the merchandise empire that grew up around it, the toys and the games and the endless ancillary machinery that comes attached to a hit. None of that was why he made the show. He made the show because he loved drawing a boy and a dog having small, strange adventures in a huge world. And somewhere along the way, the show had gotten so big that the part he loved became a smaller and smaller fraction of his job. So he let go of it. Not angrily, not publicly, just quietly. The way you'd set down something heavy you'd been carrying too long without meaning to. He stayed involved as a writer and storyboard artist for a while afterward, but by the start of the 7th season, he'd stepped back from that too, in order to focus on a movie project that, as far as the record shows, mostly consisted of him reviewing outlines and offering notes from a further and further distance. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first, because it explains something about the back half of the show that people sometimes describe as a change in direction without knowing why the direction changed. Early Adventure Time was structured the way Ward wanted it structured, which was loosely, almost recklessly, the way a Dungeons & Dragons campaign gets structured, where the writers add pieces to the world as they go, and nobody is required to remember every piece forever. Ward has said this directly. He didn't walk into the writer's room in Season 1 with a Bible full of lore about the Mushroom War and the Lich and the Crown's history. Those things accumulated. A joke about businessmen in an iceberg turned into a war. A running gag about a snail turned into an ancient god. The show built its mythology the way a coral reef builds itself, one small deposit at a time, mostly without a plan. But once Ward stepped back and Adam Muto took the wheel full time, something shifted. Muto has said in interviews that the network was initially resistant when he and the writing staff pitched the idea of moving away from the loose, episodic format towards something more serialized, more lore-heavy, more like a long book than a stack of short stories. Cartoon Network, understandably, wanted a show that a kid could drop into on any given Tuesday afternoon without needing 8 seasons of homework first. But the writers pushed for the serialized direction anyway, and you can feel the exact moment it takes hold if you watch the seasons in order, because that is precisely when the miniseries start. Stakes, islands, and elements are not filler. I want to say that plainly, because there's a strange assumption sometimes made about anything labeled a spin-off or a special event, that it must be secondary to the real show. These 3 miniseries, 8 episodes each, aired across the 7th, 8th, and 9th seasons, are where 3 of the show's most important characters, Marceline, Finn, and the very structure of Oo's 4 kingdoms, get pulled apart and put back together in ways the regular 22-minute episode format was never built to hold. They exist because the writers knew the end of the show was approaching and wanted the space to actually finish what they'd started. And there's a very specific, very human reason they knew the end was approaching, which is that Cartoon Network canceled the show in the fall of 2016, quietly, the same way Ward had left it. And the crew found out and kept working anyway, because that's what professionals do, and because they loved the thing they'd built enough to want to give it a real ending instead of an interrupted one. The reason for the cancellation is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a little bit sad in a way that has nothing to do with vampires or wars or grass demons. Fred Seibert, the producer whose company had picked up Ward's original short film and stayed attached to the franchise the whole way through, explained it to a journalist around the time the news broke. Cartoon Network's stated audience is kids age 2 to 14. Adventure Time, by its later seasons, had a substantially larger audience than that. A lot of teenagers and a lot of adults who'd grown up with the show or found it in college or discovered it because a friend told them it wasn't really a kids' show at all. That's usually described as a good problem to have, and in most senses it was, since it made the show a cultural landmark instead of just a hit. But Seibert put it plainly. The network couldn't directly benefit from that expanded audience the way they could from hitting their actual target demographic. The show was still successful. It wasn't dying in the ratings. Cartoon Network chief Rob Sorcher later told the Los Angeles Times that part of the decision was about giving the loyal, consistent viewers who'd stuck with the show for years an actual complete story rather than an ever-thinning trickle of episodes stretched indefinitely. It's a decision that reads, depending on how generous you want to be, as either a network doing right by its audience or a network politely retiring something it had quietly outgrown its own demographic math for. Probably it's both. Networks are rarely one thing. What I find worth dwelling on is what the writers did with that knowledge once they had it. They didn't panic. They didn't rush. According to head writer Kent Osborne, once the cancellation was known internally, the network actually gave the creative team a genuine stretch of time to sit with the finale before locking it down, time to think about what the show needed to resolve and what it could leave open. Storyline writing for the series, according to writer Jack Pendarvis, wrapped in mid-November of 2016, with the final storyline meeting held on the 21st of that month. The finished script was pitched to the storyboard team on November 28th. It went to producers in the 3rd week of December. Voice recording wrapped on January 31st of 2017. That's the actual, unglamorous, deadline-driven timeline behind an ending that a huge number of people still describe as one of the most emotionally satisfying series finales in the history of American television. It wasn't handed down from some grand unified vision Ward had been sitting on since season 1. It was built carefully and under real-time pressure by a team of people who cared enough to use the runway they were given as well as they possibly could. Showrunner Adam Muto later explained to TV Guide that a lot of the smaller character arcs were deliberately wrapped up in the episodes leading into the finale specifically, so the finale itself wouldn't be overloaded, so it could hit its major beats and give everyone a vignette instead of trying to cram a decade of relationships into 44 minutes. That is not the behavior of a show being switched off. That is the behavior of a show being carried gently to the end of the runway by people who understood exactly what it had become and wanted to set it down properly rather than let it crash. I want you to sit with something for a moment before we go further down, because it's the kind of quiet parallel this show is full of if you're paying attention. A man who loved drawing a boy and his dog stepped away because the thing he made had grown bigger than the part of it he could still love directly. And Simon Petrikov, 1,000 years earlier inside the story that man created, put on a crown because he loved someone, and the thing that crown eventually made him into slowly took him further and further from the part of himself he could still recognize. Neither of these is really about magic or animation. They're both about the specific, ordinary tragedy of pouring yourself into something and discovering, gradually, that the thing has changed you more than you changed it. The show didn't plan that resonance, as far as I know, and I want to be honest that this connection is my own reading rather than a stated fact. But once you notice it, it's hard to stop noticing it. If you're watching this with the lights off and headphones on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I like knowing that people are scattered across a dozen time zones right now, all sitting in their own version of this same dark quiet, listening to the same thing at completely different hours. It's a small, strange kind of company. Now let's go further down into the parts of Ooh that most casual viewers never fully see, starting with the war beneath Marceline's music. Marceline, the vampire queen, gets talked about constantly in the general conversation around this show, almost always through the lens of her 1,000 years of loneliness, her relationship with Simon in the ruins, her slow reconciliation with Princess Bubblegum. All of that is real, and all of it matters, and I'm not here to undercut any of it. But there's an entire 8-episode war buried underneath her character that gets mentioned far less often, and it's called Stakes, and it aired across 4 nights in November of 2015 during the show's 7th season, and it is, structurally, one of the strangest and most ambitious things the show ever attempted. It opens on something almost absurdly small. Marceline, out in the daylight under sunscreen and an umbrella, loses her umbrella to the wind in the middle of a desert and gets stuck, literally stuck, standing in the narrow, shrinking shadow of a lone tree, because stepping outside it means burning. It's a small, almost slapstick image, 1,000-year-old immortal being cornered by nothing more dramatic than a patch of sunlight, and it's the doorway into the whole miniseries. Because that image, more than any speech, is what pushes her to march into Princess Bubblegum's lab and ask for something she's apparently been thinking about for a long time. She wants her vampiric essence removed. She wants to stop being a vampire. She tells Bonnabelle later in the miniseries, in a scene the show plays with real weight rather than comedy, that bad things happened to her as a kid, that becoming a vampire happened while she was still just what she calls a messed up kid, and that even after 1,000 years, she still feels messed up and empty inside. She would rather be mortal. She would rather grow up. That is the actual stated motivation, spoken plainly by the character herself, and it reframes everything else that happens across the following 7 episodes as the fallout of someone trying to become a different kind of person and finding out that the past doesn't let go just because you asked it to. Bonnibel performs the procedure. It works, at least at first. Marceline gets to walk in direct sunlight for what might be the first time in centuries. And then, the essence that Bonnibel extracted doesn't simply vanish. It escapes, spilled by Peppermint Butler in an accident, and its release wakes up 5 ancient vampires who represent, structurally, the specific pieces of Marceline's own history and nature that the essence had apparently been carrying inside her the whole time. This is where the show does something genuinely clever with its own mythology, because these 5 vampires aren't named after generic vampire tropes. They're named after tarot cards. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, and, at the very top of the hierarchy, the Vampire King himself, the entity who originally turned Marceline into what she became. Each of them, according to the way fans and critics who've studied the miniseries closely have broken it down, seems to represent a different relationship to change and tradition, which turns out to be the actual thematic spine running underneath all the staking and hunting and action movie plotting on the surface. The Empress talks wistfully about the old days when she had minions and drank fancy blood flecked with gold, and her entire plotline involves reasserting old world dominance by hypnotizing the Ice King and sending him after Finn's blood like a servant from a bygone century. The Hierophant, whose entire tarot association is tradition and orthodoxy, refuses every modern alternative offered to him, refuses even the option of subsisting on the color red instead of actual blood the way Marceline herself has learned to, and gets destroyed, specifically because of that refusal, an old guard creature who can't survive contact with a changed world because he won't change with it. And the Vampire King, when Marceline finally faces him again near the end, essentially voices the miniseries' whole argument out loud. He asks her, more or less, why would any creature still want to be the Vampire King in this age, in this new world, clinging to an old war between agents of darkness, when a person could simply choose to step outside of that struggle instead? It's the Vampire King, Marceline's original tormentor and creator, offering something closer to weary self-awareness than villainy in his final moments. And the show lets that landing be complicated rather than triumphant. There's a detail buried in the miniseries that I think is worth pulling all the way out into the light, which is exactly how Marceline sustains herself. This isn't a traditional vampire mythology transplanted wholesale into a candy-colored cartoon. Marceline doesn't drink blood. She consumes the color red itself, red in the abstract, which means she can eat a strawberry or drink a glass of fruit punch, or, in one of the show's stranger and more memorable images, simply suck the redness out of an object and leave it visibly drained of color while leaving its physical substance completely intact. It's a detail that could have stayed a throwaway joke, the kind of thing a writer invents because it's funny and visually interesting. And on one level, that's exactly what it is. But it also does real narrative work, because it's the thing that keeps her tethered to something gentler than her origin. A being that needs blood to survive is a predator by biological necessity. A being that needs the color red can live an entire life without hurting anyone, feeding on ketchup and cherries in the inside of a ripe tomato, And that small mercy of design is, I think, part of why the show is able to treat her as fundamentally sympathetic, even while she's technically, mechanically, still a monster by any classical definition. The show gave her a version of vampirism with an escape hatch built into its biology, and then spent an entire miniseries asking whether she actually wants to use it. She doesn't, in the end. Or rather, she can't, not permanently. Defeating the Vampire King requires her to draw on her full vampiric power one more time, and the miniseries closes with her once again bitten, once again a vampire, and the show, to its enormous credit, doesn't treat this as a defeat or a tragedy. It treats it as an acceptance. The final episode is titled The Dark Cloud, and it ends with Marceline singing a song called Everything Stays, written by Rebecca Sugar, the same artist who would go on to create Steven Universe after cutting her teeth as a storyboard artist on this show. Sugar came back specifically for this miniseries, not just to write the song, but to voice a new character, Marceline's mother, in what was actually her first credited voice acting role in her career. The song plays over a montage of Ooh slowly returning to normal, and critics singled it out immediately as the emotional peak of the entire miniseries, a piece of music doing more grief processing in 3 minutes than most half-hour episodes managed to do at all. One critic writing about the miniseries afterward argued that the whole thing functions as a meditation on depression, and that its real achievement isn't showing Marceline defeat the feeling entirely, since that's not really how depression tends to work, but showing that the act of fighting it is itself what allows her to grow. Another reviewer, writing for Techno Buffalo, praised the way the show handled her realization that change is difficult but necessary, specifically pointing to a moment in the miniseries where Marceline nearly gives up entirely, worn down by the sheer repetitive futility of fighting the same old battles again, only to have the Ice King, of all people, sit down next to her and essentially call her a coward for wanting to quit. It is a strange, blunt, oddly perfect piece of intervention, delivered by the one character in the show who understands losing yourself better than anyone else alive, and it's enough to get her back up. The miniseries wasn't universally beloved on release. A review in the AV Club gave it a solid but not glowing grade, noting specifically that the miniseries lost some of its power whenever it drifted away from Marceline's interior, personal material, and toward the more conventional vampire hunting action plot. That's a fair criticism, and I want to name it plainly, rather than pretend every piece of this show landed perfectly every time, because part of taking a subject seriously is being honest about where it stumbles. But even the more mixed reviews tend to agree on the same thing, which is that whenever Stakes slows down and simply lets Marceline sit inside her own history, whenever it lingers on the specific texture of 1,000 years of survival rather than the mechanics of staking one more vampire, it becomes something genuinely rare in children's animation. It became so highly regarded within the show's own production culture that director Tom Herpick won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Animation, specifically for his work on the Stakes finale. One of several Emmy wins the show accumulated across its run, a fact that tends to get lost underneath the broader, louder cultural memory of Adventure Time as simply a weird cartoon about a boy and his dog. There's a quieter thread running through the flashback material in Stakes that I think gets overshadowed by the more immediate business of staking tarot-named vampires, and it involves a human survivor named Two Bread Tom and the tribe of humans he led through the ruins in the years after the war, back when Marceline herself was still young enough to be traveling among them rather than living apart from every other living thing the way she does by the show's present day. As Marceline grew into her role as something close to a dedicated vampire hunter, the flashbacks show her driving the vampire population towards something close to actual extinction, and the show frames this not simply as heroism but as something more ambiguous, a kind of overzealous crusade that costs her relationships even as it succeeds at its stated goal. Meanwhile, Tom's tribe, watching atmospheric conditions shift in ways that suggested some larger, unprecedented change was coming to the continent, made the decision to repair an old wrecked cargo ship and simply leave U entirely to search for a habitable place further away from whatever the land was becoming. When the ship neared completion, Tom offered Marceline a place aboard it, telling her she was one of them, human enough, even now, to belong with the people trying to escape. She never got the chance to properly answer because vampires attacked the group before she could, and the moment closes without resolution. One more example of this show's tendency to let a door swing open just long enough for you to see through it before circumstances slam it shut again. I find that unresolved offer worth sitting with because it means there was, at some specific point in Marceline's very long life, a real fork in the road where she might have left U behind entirely and lived out her days among the last remnants of ordinary humanity, instead of becoming the 1,000-year fixture she eventually became. She didn't take it. Whether she consciously chose to stay or simply never got the chance to choose is something the show leaves open, and I want to be honest that this is genuinely ambiguous rather than settled, but either way, the land of U got to keep her, and whatever human tribe two-bred Tom was leading towards some other shore sailed off into a part of this story we never get to follow. There's one more detail from Marceline's deeper mythology worth surfacing here, because it connects stakes to something that happens much later in the show's 9th season in a separate miniseries called Elements, and it's easy to miss if you're not watching for the connective tissue between these later years. During the events of Elements, when the entire land of U gets consumed by runaway elemental magic, Marceline is temporarily transformed by that same magic into a being called Marshmalline, the Campfire Queen, a sweet, candy elemental version of herself, with none of the vampiric edge. And this transformation later gets referenced back inside the show's own continuity, when Marceline recounts the experience to BMO years afterward in an episode called Catch Up, using language so allegorical and strange that the show seems to be actively commenting on how difficult it is to put an experience like that into ordinary words. I'm noting this mostly because it's a small, quiet example of how tightly woven this show's mythology actually is underneath its loose surface. A joke transformation in one miniseries becomes a piece of remembered trauma processed years later in a completely different, much quieter episode. Nothing in this show's later run is really thrown away. It just waits, sometimes for years, to matter again. Now we go somewhere. The show almost never lets its camera linger, which is out past the edge of the mainland entirely, into open water, following Finn on a journey that finally answers the single largest unresolved mystery about his character. What actually happened to the rest of the human race, and where, if anywhere, they went. For the majority of the show's run, Finn's status as apparently the only human being left in the land of U functions almost like ambient sadness, a fact everyone acknowledges and nobody fully investigates, treated with a lightness in the early seasons that only gradually reveals its actual weight, as Finn himself grows up enough to start asking harder questions about it. That investigation finally gets a real vehicle in January of 2017 in the eighth season miniseries called Islands, which opens with the arrival of a strange robotic transport ship in hunting for mutants, clearly built by and for other humans. Jake, in a moment of pure, impulsive Jake logic, immediately smashes it. Finn, horrified at the potential loss of the first hard evidence of other humans he's ever encountered, insists they investigate anyway and brings along Susan Strong, a character the show had introduced years earlier as another apparent human, though one whose exact nature had always remained ambiguous. The 8 episodes that follow send Finn, Jake, BMO, and Susan out across open ocean toward a set of islands southwest of and the show uses the format the same way it used Stakes, treating the miniseries structure as license to let single relationships and revelations breathe across multiple episodes instead of compressing them into one. They meet Whipple, a sea dragon so relentlessly, exhaustingly cheerful that the crew of sailors who'd been transporting him were driven to something close to mutiny by his personality alone, a joke that the show plays for real laughs before pivoting, in typical Adventure Time fashion, into something more tender once Whipple proves himself useful and kind, despite being almost unbearable to be around. They find a man named Alva living alone on an island, in possession of old home movies documenting other pockets of human survival, fragments of a wider human diaspora that the show had never shown before. And gradually, piece by piece, island by island, the show reconstructs the actual love story of Finn's biological parents, a woman named Minerva Campbell and a man named Martin Mertens, who the show nicknames Min and Marty in flashback, and whose relationship the show frames as one that crossed opposing sides of some kind of internal human hierarchy in the years right after the war, 2 people from different factions who fell for each other anyway. It's a piece of backstory that recontextualizes everything the audience already knew about Martin's absence and Finn's abandonment, because it turns out the separation wasn't simply a father choosing to leave. It was tangled up in something larger and more structural, a fracture in the surviving human community itself. The emotional center of the miniseries, though, is Founders Island, the hidden settlement where the last significant concentration of surviving humans built a society specifically organized around never letting what happened to the old world happen again. It's a community run, as one reviewer accurately described it, like something close to a cult, governed by a strict doctrine that the outside world is dangerous and the inside world is safe, indoctrinating its children from birth to value, order, and containment over curiosity, actively capturing and re-educating anyone who tries to leave. Minerva Campbell, Finn's mother, is at the center of this structure, and the show is careful never to make her simply a villain for it. She's a doctor. She cares, visibly and completely, about the people under her protection. She had, at some point after the war, uploaded her own consciousness into a network of robotic caretakers, specifically so she could extend her ability to look after the population indefinitely, sacrificing something essential about her own individual continuity in exchange for the capacity to keep watching over everyone forever. Her caution isn't irrational. The world outside her island really is dangerous, really is full of magic and monsters and unpredictable violence that her community has been sheltered from for 1,000 years. But that shelter has come at the cost of freedom, and the miniseries builds toward a moment where Minerva, believing to be more of a threat to her people than it actually is, attempts to forcibly upload the consciousness of everyone on the island an act of protection that would also be an act of erasure. Finn stops her not through force, but by sharing his own memories with her directly, showing her, from the inside, what it has actually meant to spend his life helping people out in that supposedly dangerous world. And it's enough to make her back down and reconsider a belief she's apparently held with total conviction for a very long time. By the end of the miniseries, the humans of Founders Island are given something they'd never had before, which is a real choice. Most stay. A character named Frida, Susan's childhood friend from before Susan even remembered being human, chooses to leave with Susan instead. The two of them setting off to have their own adventures together. Having repaired a friendship the show had spent the whole miniseries carefully damaging and mending. And Finn, before sailing home, has one last conversation with his mother through a virtual reality interface, the two of them embracing inside a digital space, because that is the only kind of physical closeness her current form allows, which is its own small, strange, quietly devastating image if you sit with it. A mother and son able to hold each other only inside a simulation because the actual woman gave up her body a long time ago in service of a promise to keep everyone else safe. There's a smaller detour inside the miniseries, an episode centered on the character Alva that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it's one of the bleakest single episodes the show ever produced, and it barely involves Finn's main quest at all. Alva is a human man. Finn finds marooned alone on an island, and over the course of the episode, it becomes clear that his isolation isn't recent. He has apparently spent an enormous stretch of time entirely by himself, sustained mostly by old home movies, filmed recordings of other human survivors from scattered pockets of the post-war world, footage he watches obsessively, the way a person might watch old family videos of people who are no longer reachable. It's a quiet echo of Simon's own VHS tapes, another human being alone with recorded images of a world he can no longer physically return to, and the show doesn't spell out the parallel, doesn't need to, having trained its audience by this point to recognize the shape of a person substituting recordings for actual contact. Whipple, the sea dragon whose relentless cheerfulness had apparently worn an entire crew of sailors down to the point of near mutiny, gets a gentler treatment than that setup initially promises, because underneath the exhausting positivity, the show reveals someone who is, more than anything, just desperate for company. A desperation so complete that even being unbearable seems, to him, worth the risk if it means someone might stay. Adventure Time has a very consistent habit, once you start looking for it across its later seasons, of taking a character who initially reads as purely comic and discovering, patiently, that the comedy was covering something a great deal sadder underneath, and Whipple is as clean an example of that pattern as the show ever produced. The love story between Finn's parents, once the miniseries finally lays it out in full, complicates the earlier, simpler version of Martin Mertens that longtime viewers had already been given plenty of reason to dislike. Min and Marty, as the flashbacks refer to them, come from opposing sides of some internal hierarchy within the surviving human population in the years directly following the war, and the show frames their relationship as something closer to forbidden than merely awkward. Two people from different factions falling for each other despite structural pressure pushing them apart. It doesn't excuse what Martin does afterward. The abandonment of Finn, the years of near total absence, the fundamentally self-interested nature. The show keeps circling back to whenever he reappears in later seasons. but it does add a layer of specific historical weight to why things fell apart between him and Minerva that a simple character flaw wouldn't have explained on its own. And it's the kind of detail this show consistently uses to make even its most disappointing characters feel like the product of an actual world, rather than a simple narrative obstacle standing between Finn and a happy ending. It's worth pausing here on Susan Strong herself, because her arc across this miniseries deepens a character the show had introduced years earlier, mostly as a mystery and a bit of a punchline. It's revealed across islands that Susan was originally a girl named Kara, raised on Founders Island alongside Frida, and that her departure from that world left her in what the site Adventure Time Review described as a completely primitive state, having to relearn essentially everything from scratch with no context beyond whatever fragments other people taught her along the way. It's a detail that recasts her entire earlier characterization, her strange speech patterns, her enormous physical strength, her odd relationship to normal social behavior, not as comic eccentricity, but as the visible aftermath of someone who was violently uprooted from the only structure she'd ever known and had to build an entire adult identity back up from nothing, alone in a hostile world. The show doesn't dwell on this reading explicitly. It simply lays the facts down and trusts you to feel the shape of what they mean, which, by this point in our journey through this show, should feel like a familiar move. The miniseries wasn't without its critics either, and I think it's worth naming that honestly, instead of only praising it. Several reviewers pointed out that the final two episodes felt notably rushed compared to the patient, layered episodes that preceded them, that the philosophical debate the show was clearly trying to stage between safety and exploration, between Minerva's caution and Finn's instinct toward risk, never quite got the fair, two-sided treatment the show usually gives its central conflicts. One reviewer noted that Adventure Time is normally scrupulously even-handed about big thematic arguments, citing the way it handled magic versus science in an earlier episode called Wizards Only, Fools, or War versus Peace in an episode called The Cooler, and felt that Islands never fully earned its own conclusion that overprotection is worse than danger, because it never gave Minerva's side of that argument the same weight it gave Finn's. That's a legitimate critique of a miniseries that was, by its own writer's later admission, produced under real-time and resource constraints as the show moved toward its planned ending. I mention it not to undercut what the miniseries accomplishes, which is genuinely a great deal, but because an honest account of anything worth loving has to include the places where it didn't quite reach as far as it was aiming. Let's surface, and then go down again, this time into the strangest and least seen of the three miniseries, the one that almost nobody outside the hardest core of the fandom talks about, called Elements, which aired across 4 nights in April of 2017, and which, according to the show's own production history, performed so poorly in the ratings, with every episode drawing under 1 million viewers at the time, that some analysts have attributed the low numbers less to quality and more to a near total absence of marketing and promotion heading into it. That's a shame, because structurally and thematically, Elements might be the most ambitious thing this show ever attempted, precisely because of how strange its premise is. Finn, Jake, and Bimo return home from the events of Islands to discover that everything has changed while they were gone. Ooh has been overtaken entirely by extreme elemental magic, splitting the whole land into 4 distorted, exaggerated versions of its original 4 kingdoms: candy, ice, slime, and fire. Princess Bubblegum herself has been transformed into an enormous candy tower, a being with the power to forcibly convert any matter, including people, into candy, and she's already used that power on most of the population, who wander around in a state of blissed out, brainwashed happiness that the show frames as genuinely unsettling rather than sweet. BMO gets swept up in this candy conversion almost immediately. Finn and Jake are rescued by the Ice King, who ferries them up to the Sky Kingdom, where they can finally see the full scope of what's happened to the world below. What makes Elements genuinely clever, once you look past the surface chaos, is that each of the four corrupted kingdoms maps directly onto one of the four classical temperaments from ancient humoral psychology, a framework going back to Greek medicine that divided human personality into sanguine, melancholic, phlegmatic, and choleric types. The candy element and Bubblegum's mass conversion of the population corresponds to the sanguine temperament, all forced happiness, enthusiasm, and relentless, glassy-eyed positivity. The ice element corresponds to melancholic, and it's ruled over by a character named Patience Saint, Pym, whose domed territory is populated by beings sunk into quiet, unshakable pessimism and sadness. The slime element corresponds to phlegmatic, embodied by an endless, apathetic roller skating party at the Slime Kingdom, where the losers of a skating competition get physically absorbed into Slime Princess's own body, and even the winners, it turns out, share the same ultimate fate. And the fire element corresponds to choleric, aggression, and irritability turned all the way up, embodied by a berserk, dragon-transformed flame princess ruling over a kingdom consumed by rage. What the show is actually arguing, underneath the surface absurdity of a giant candy tower, princess, and a wolf-headed party god making cameo appearances throughout the wider mythology, is a question about whether any single emotional state, even a supposedly positive one, becomes monstrous once it's allowed to run completely unchecked and uncomplicated by anything else. Permanent happiness turns out to be a kind of prison. Permanent sorrow turns out to be another kind. Permanent numbness and permanent rage are simply different shapes of the same basic problem, which is a person or an entire land losing access to the full range of what it actually means to feel things in proportion, in context, moving between states, rather than getting stuck inside just one of them forever. Finn's own arc across the miniseries plays this theme out directly and, at points, quite brutally, for what is nominally still a show for children. Deep in the transformed Fire Kingdom, hunting for Flame Princess, his ex-girlfriend, now consumed entirely by the rage element, Finn loses his temper and begins physically attacking her, an act of violence. The show doesn't play as heroic or justified, and the confrontation ends with Finn himself getting transformed into a fire person, consumed by the very temperament he'd just been fighting against in someone else. It's a blunt, almost uncomfortable piece of moral symmetry, the hero briefly becoming the thing he came to defeat, and it's staged specifically inside a story about his relationship history with the person he's fighting, which makes it read less like an action beat and more like an admission that unprocessed romantic anger doesn't just disappear because a relationship ends. Lumpy Space Princess, a character the show has historically used mostly as comic relief, gets one of her most substantial arcs in the whole series here, ending up as the miniseries' unlikely hero, the one character with the emotional range and stability to navigate between all four extreme temperaments without getting swallowed by any of them, precisely because her established personality has always been messier and more human than the show usually lets her be. Betty Groff, Simon's fiancée, and by this point, a recurring and increasingly desperate figure in the mythology, drives a significant amount of the plot here too. Her own hunger for magical knowledge and power, pushing the story toward the darker corners it needs to reach to set up the finale that would follow 2 seasons later. And the Ice King, so often reduced to comic relief or pitiable background noise in the regular episode format, gets treated by Elements as a genuine, capable team player for what might be the only extended stretch of the entire series, flying Finn and Jake to safety, coordinating strategy, being useful in a way the writers themselves have noted is a rare gift to give a character who usually only gets to be ignored or laughed at. One detail from Elements is worth sitting with specifically because of what it says about how carefully this show's background art actually gets constructed, even in a miniseries most people never watched. According to storyboard artist Steve Wolfhard, every single one of the 4 classical elementals is deliberately hidden somewhere inside the show's own title sequence for this miniseries. Tiny visual clues planted in a 30-second intro that most viewers would blink past without ever registering. A level of internal consistency and care that the show almost never gets credit for because so few people ever went looking for it in a miniseries this poorly promoted. That's the kind of detail that tells you everything about the culture of the people actually making this thing. They weren't just filling episode orders. They were still, right up through a low-rated miniseries in the show's 9th season, hiding tiny, deliberate gifts inside the corners of frames for the handful of people who'd bother to pause and look. Before we get to Fern, there's a layer sitting just above him worth surfacing because it explains the strange logic that governs everything else we've covered so far, the actual chain of command, so to speak, that this entire universe quietly runs on underneath its candy and its wars. Adventure Time populates its cosmology with what fans and the show itself sometimes refer to as eternal beings, entities that exist outside the normal rules of mortality, causality, and consequence that govern everyone else. And once you start listing them out, the sheer range of what counts as divine in this world becomes almost comic, which I think is entirely the point. At the more grounded end of that hierarchy sits Death, ruler of the land of the dead, rendered visually as a tall, gaunt figure in a wide-brimmed hat that consciously evokes the iconography of the American Old West rather than the traditional scythe and cloak Grim Reaper most children's media reaches for. What makes the show's version of Death genuinely interesting is how approachable he is. His realm can be visited by the living under the right circumstances, which Peppermint Butler, of all characters, apparently does with some regularity, given how casually the show has established his ongoing friendship with Death across multiple episodes, a detail that recontextualizes Peppermint Butler's entire presence in the Candy Kingdom the moment you actually sit with it. Here is a small, cheerful, courteous butler serving candy tea and folding candy napkins by day, who also happens to be on a first-name basis with the literal personification of mortality, comfortable enough in that relationship to summon portals to the underworld as casual favors for Finn and Jake. The show plays this almost entirely for laughs on the surface and almost never for horror, and yet the horror is sitting right there if you let yourself actually look at it, the same way the ruins sit quietly in the background of every outdoor scene, whether or not the characters ever look down and notice them. Above Death, in terms of raw cosmic scale, if not necessarily menace, sits an entire pantheon-like cluster of beings associated with Mars, most notably the four-faced deity known collectively as Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, a single entity split across four voices and four faces, historically responsible for things like defeating the ancient world-breaking entity Orgalorg long before recorded history, back when Orgalorg still had ambitions of consuming entire galaxies rather than knocking over the Ice King's furniture as a forgetful penguin. There's a strange, almost bureaucratic quality to how the show treats these Martian deities, as though the universe has an actual functioning cosmic order behind the scenes. Administrators handling the paperwork of catastrophe prevention on a scale no mortal character in the show could ever meaningfully interact with, let alone comprehend. Then there's the cosmic owl, a figure that occupies a much stranger, the much more intimate niche in the mythology than any of the more overtly powerful beings do. The cosmic owl appears almost exclusively inside dreams, and the show establishes, gradually and without much fanfare, that whatever the cosmic owl appears within a dream tends to eventually come true in waking life, giving the character a quiet, oracular menace, despite never once, as far as the record shows, directly intervening in the physical world the way Golb or the Lich do. It's the cosmic owl who shows up disguised as a singing poodle woman during the dream sequence in the finale, distracting Bubblegum at exactly the moment Gumball needs to escape, a detail so subtle that a huge number of viewers who watched the finale in real time apparently missed it entirely on first viewing, only catching the connection once fan communities pieced it together afterward. The cosmic owl doesn't rule anything. It doesn't demand worship or obedience. It simply watches dreams, and by watching them, in some fashion the show never explains, and doesn't need to, make certain ones real. And then, sitting at what might be the single lowest rung of this entire cosmic hierarchy, refusing with total consistency to be anything other than exactly what he appears to be, there's the party god, a floating disembodied wolf's head, wearing a backwards baseball cap, whose entire domain of influence, so far as the show ever establishes, is partying. He can sense parties happening anywhere. He can divide himself into smaller wolves. He fires beams of pure, overwhelming party energy from his mouth, capable of filling another being with what the show describes, quite literally, as the strength of 1,000 partying demons. He is, by his own established behavior, genuinely one of the pettier and more selfish entities in the entire mythology, neglecting the girlfriend he did have, the island lady, so consistently and so completely in favor of non-stop partying that she eventually left him for the comparatively more attentive Ice King, and the show treats his subsequent jealous rage with the same straight-faced absurdity it treats everything else about him. And yet he shows up, later, at Prismo's own party inside the time room, an entity that exists outside of time itself, apparently still enjoys throwing parties, and still invites, or at least tolerates, the god of partying as a guest. I want to be honest that some of the finer connective tissue here, exactly how the party god gets from being launched into deep space in one episode to reappearing at Prismo's gathering in another, is left genuinely unexplained by the show itself. The kind of loose thread this particular corner of the mythology seems comfortable, simply leaving loose. What I find worth dwelling on, looking at this entire strange hierarchy laid out together, is how unbothered the show is by the wild difference in scale and dignity between its various eternal beings. Golb can unmake the fabric of a battlefield without meaning to. The Lich can end a species. Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod administer catastrophes on a cosmic scale humans were never meant to fully understand. And somewhere in the middle of all of that sits a wolf head in a backwards cap whose entire personality is refusing to stop partying long enough to notice he's hurting someone who loves him. The show never asks you to take one of these beings more seriously than the others, simply because it's more powerful. It treats the party god's small, selfish tragedy with exactly as much narrative sincerity as it treats Gulb's incomprehensible chaos, which tells you something true about how this entire universe actually works underneath its mythology. Scale isn't the same thing as meaning. A god can be enormous and still be, at his core, just a guy who won't put down the drink long enough to see who he's hurting. I mention all of this here, in the middle of our descent, rather than at the very bottom where cosmology usually gets saved for in most breakdowns of this show, because I think the order actually matters. Most explanations of Adventure Time's mythology build upward, starting small with Finn and Jake, and ending huge with Golb and the nature of chaos itself, treating scale as a proxy for importance. But spending real time with the miniseries era, with Marceline's tarot-named vampires, and Finn's fractured human colonies, and an entire kingdom split into 4 temperaments, teaches you something different, which is that this show never actually organized its own values along a ladder of cosmic significance. A penguin god who just wants to be liked, a butler with an underworld connection he never brags about, a wolfhead who can't stop partying long enough to keep a relationship, a war fought over 3 candy people, built to fill the silence after a catastrophe, a boy made of grass who chose his own ending, a robot who forgot a name but kept the feeling. All of it sits on the same emotional plane in this show's actual practice, regardless of how the mythology charts would rank them on paper. That refusal to sort its own subjects by scale is, I think, the single most reliable thing you can say about how this show actually thinks. Underneath every crown and every comet and every candy kingdom it ever built. Now we go down into something smaller and stranger still. A single character whose entire existence is a kind of philosophical experiment. The show ran almost by accident and then had to keep following once it started, because that character refused to stay a joke. This is the story of Fern. It begins, as these things so often do in this show, with an object bought for $3. Finn, needing a replacement for his broken demon blood sword, wanders with Jake into the tent of a character called the Grassy Wizard, buys a sword woven from grass for $3, and is warned by the wizard, in a whispered aside as they leave, that there are no takebacks. It's a classic cursed object setup, the kind of fairy tale device that's existed for centuries. And for a long stretch of episodes, the grass sword functions exactly the way you'd expect. An unusually effective, a slightly sentient weapon that Finn wields and occasionally worries about, its true nature left deliberately vague. Then, in an episode called Reboot, during a fight, the grass sword and Finn's other significant blade, known simply as the Finn sword, an object with its own strange history involving a miniaturized, dream-trapped version of Finn living inside it, collide and merge, and something climbs out of that collision that has never existed before. It has all of Finn's memories up until that exact moment. It looks almost exactly like him, and for a while, genuinely, it believes it is him. The show names this being Fern, and spends a remarkable amount of care across the following seasons, working through what it actually means for a person to discover they are a copy built from someone else's memories and a demon's malice, and not the original at all. Fern's early appearances are marked by real identity confusion, a violent instinct to defend the world the way Finn would, and a growing, painful awareness that he isn't received the same way Finn is by the people around him. He eventually tracks down his actual creator, the Grassy Wizard, hoping for some kind of explanation, some deeper purpose behind his existence, and what he gets instead is almost insultingly mundane. The wizard admits he built the grass sword purely because the phrase blade of grass sounded cool as a pun, with no grand design behind it at all. Fern's reaction to that anticlimax, according to the record of the episode, is to punch the wizard hard enough to put him in the hospital. A burst of violence the show frames with real sympathy, because what do you do with the discovery that the entire reason for your existence was somebody's throwaway wordplay? Finn, notably, doesn't punish Fern for this. He tells him he did a good job, and it's here, slowly, that Fern starts to become something more than a mistake to be corrected, coining his own name for himself, Fern the Human, an act of self-naming that the show treats as genuinely significant, a being asserting an identity distinct from the one he was accidentally handed. Underneath all of this sits the grass demon, revealed later to be the actual curse embedded inside the grass sword from the very beginning, a small, self-described octopus spider creature that fused with the miniaturized Finn trapped inside the broken Finn sword to actually create Fern's physical form and, crucially, his more aggressive, hostile edges, the parts of his personality that read as darker and less gentle than Finn's. Fern needs the demon to have a body at all, which is a genuinely unsettling piece of metaphysics buried inside what still reads, on the surface, as a fairly standard cartoon subplot. He is not simply Finn's double. He is Finn's memories fused permanently with something that was built specifically to be a curse, and for a long stretch of the show's final seasons, that fusion sits there, mostly dormant, occasionally flaring into real menace. It flares hardest once Uncle Gumbald enters the picture, a character whose full significance we'll get to shortly, because Gumbald is the one who resurrects Fern after Finn accidentally kills him in an episode called 3 Buckets, shattering him into scattered grass and leaving behind, among the wreckage, nothing but his eyeball. Gumbald rebuilds him into something called the Green Knight, weaponizing Fern's confusion and resentment as part of a larger plan to destabilize both Finn and Princess Bubblegum in the lead-up to the finale. Under the grass demon's growing influence, Fern's hostility toward the original Finn deepens into something closer to outright rivalry, a being increasingly convinced that he, not the copy, deserves to actually be Finn, to take over the life and the relationships and the identity that were only ever partially his to begin with. The resolution to all of this happens inside a shared dream, engineered by Nightmare Princess, in the same extended sequence that also resolves the war between Bubblegum and Gumbald, and it's genuinely one of the stranger, more psychologically direct confrontations the show ever staged. Finn appeals to Fern directly, reminding him that they are, as he puts it, two sides of the same coin, sharing the same fundamental torment of not quite knowing where one of them ends and the other begins. Together, they descend into a kind of internal vault where the grass demon itself is waiting, wrapped physically around the miniature Finn, still trapped in the shrunken sword form at the very root of Fern's existence. And the demon tells them plainly that without it, Fern has no body at all, that killing it will end him too. Fern kills it anyway. It's an act of self-destruction disguised as an act of liberation, and the show is honest about that tension rather than pretending the two are the same thing. He rids himself of the influence that made him cruel, and in doing so guarantees his own dissolution, because a being made partly of curse cannot simply subtract the curse and remain whole. What follows is one of the gentlest, saddest images in the show's entire back half. Princess Bubblegum, present in the dream, reaches out to touch Fern, and her hand passes straight through him because he no longer has a body to be touched. When everyone wakes, Fern begins to physically disintegrate in the real world, and the show gives him a proper farewell rather than an abrupt vanishing. He shares a genuine, tearful goodbye with Finn, who promises to plant what's left of him in the ruins of the destroyed tree fort. And true to that promise, in the show's final minutes, Finn and Jake do exactly that. From Fern's remains, which take the shape of a small seed shaped like the Finn sword, an enormous new tree grows, and lodged in its highest branches sits a fully remade Finn sword. The show then jumps forward 1,000 years to two entirely new characters, Shermie and Beth, who climb that same tree and retrieve that same sword in the final minutes of the finale, striking a pose that deliberately mirrors Finn and Jake's own pose from the very first seconds of the show's original opening title sequence, a visual rhyme suggesting, without ever stating it outright, that these two are becoming their own generation's version of the heroes we've just spent 10 seasons following. I want to be honest about the layer of interpretation sitting on top of these facts, because it matters. The show never explicitly confirms that Shermie carrying the reforged Finn sword means anything mystical about reincarnation or inheritance beyond the purely symbolic. What we know for certain, factually, is that Fern's remains grew a tree, that a sword grew inside that tree, and that a new pair of adventurers found it 1,000 years later and posed the way Finn and Jake once posed. Whether that constitutes a genuine cyclical rebirth of heroism in the same register as the Catalyst Comet mythology the show establishes elsewhere, or whether it's simply a poetic visual bookend without any deeper metaphysical claim behind it, is something the show leaves for the audience to decide. I lean toward reading it as intentional resonance rather than coincidence, given how carefully everything else in this stretch of the show was constructed, but I want to be clear that this specific reading is interpretation, not confirmed fact. There's something almost unbearably tender about the fact that Fern's entire arc, from an accidental joke about a pun to a genuine, mourned death with a proper goodbye, exists at all inside a kid's show that could easily have let him remain a one-off gag forever. The show built an entire meditation on identity, originality, inherited trauma, and the specific grief of realizing you were made, rather than born, out of a sword a boy bought for $3 because his old one broke. That is, in miniature, the entire method of this show laid bare. Nothing gets thrown away. Everything gets followed all the way down, eventually, if you give it enough seasons. Before we go down into the war itself, I want to spend a moment on the character the show chose to frame that entire war through, because the choice is stranger and more pointed than it looks at first glance. The finale doesn't open on Finn. It doesn't open on Bubblegum, or Marceline, or even the land of Ooh as we know it. It opens 1,000 years further down the timeline than anything we've seen, on two brand new characters, a cat-like adventurer named Shermie and his friend Beth, who is established as a distant descendant of Jake and Lady Rainicorn, digging a rusted mechanical arm out of the dirt. They go looking for someone who can tell them what it is, and the person they find, ruling the land of Ooh, a full millennium after everything we know, calling himself the King of Ooh, is BMO, still there, still, somehow, functioning. A small video game console that Finn's adoptive parents apparently found or built or acquired sometime in Finn's early childhood has, through means the show never fully explains and doesn't need to, simply outlasted every single other character in the entire mythology by roughly 1,000 years. Sit with that for a second, because I think it's one of the quietest, strangest decisions the writers made in the entire run of the show. BMO was never framed as cosmically significant the way Finn was, with his blue catalyst comet and his ancient pattern of incarnated heroism. BMO was never ancient the way Marceline or the Lich were. BMO was, on the show's own established terms, simply a toy, a beloved one, treated with real tenderness, referred to by Finn and Jake in a way that the show plays completely straight, as parental rather than possessive, but a toy nonetheless. A small machine built to be fun, and it's that machine, not the hero, not the vampire, not the scientist princess, who is left standing at the very end of everything, alone at the top of a mountain called Mount Cragdor, surrounded by relics and keepsakes of a life that everyone else who lived through it is now gone from. When Shermie and Beth show up, according to the way the finale plays it, BMO has genuinely, mechanically forgotten Finn's actual name. At one point, BMO calls him Fred. Later, Phil. It is a small detail, and it lands like a hammer, because BMO is a machine, a being built out of circuits and memory storage, and the show is telling you plainly that even something engineered specifically to remember things eventually loses the exact shape of a name it once knew better than almost anyone alive. And yet, even having lost the name, BMO still visibly warms at the sight of Finn's old arm, still agrees, after some initial gruffness, to tell these two strangers the entire story, still clearly remembers, in whatever form memory takes for a small, ageless robot, that these people mattered enormously once. The facts are forgotten. The feeling outlasts the facts. That is not a minor detail buried in the finale's trivia. I think it might be close to the actual thesis of the whole show, restated one final time through the one character built, on paper, to be the least emotionally significant of them all. There's a small, almost throwaway piece of symmetry buried in this ending too, worth naming because it closes a loop. The show opened all the way back near the beginning of its mythology. Gunter, the Ice King's favorite penguin, revealed years earlier to secretly be the ancient cosmic entity. Orgalorg, compressed down into a small flightless bird, picks up the ice crown once Simon is finally permanently freed from it during the fight with Golb. Just as a young dinosaur once put on the very first version of that crown millions of years earlier and, wanting nothing more than to be like his beloved guardian, became the template for every ice wizard who would ever wear it afterward, this Gunter, having spent centuries being cared for by the very man that crown eventually consumed, now puts it on himself and becomes something new. Not a copy of Simon's madness, but a gentler, happier echo of him, a being the show calls the Ice Thing, who goes on to marry Turtle Princess and effectively becomes the next Ice King. The crown, the same object that carried one small creature's desperate love for a mentor across 65 million years into a Scandinavian antiquarian's hands, finds its way onto a new wearer at the very close of the story, and this time, for once, gets to end somewhere kind. Which brings us to the very last thing buried at the bottom of this particular iceberg, the war that actually ends the show, and the family, if you can call it that, at the center of it. Uncle Gumbald first gets mentioned all the way back in an early episode called Susan Strong, as an offhand reference, Princess Bubblegum casually noting that he'd once cut down an entire field of taffy trees overnight, for reasons nobody explained at the time. For years he existed as exactly that, a strange background detail, a name dropped without context, the kind of thing this show plants constantly and sometimes doesn't return to. For a decade, he finally becomes a major character in the show's 8th season, and the finale reveals, through flashback in an episode appropriately called Bonnabelle Bubblegum, the actual origin of everything that follows. In the immediate aftermath of the Mushroom War, a very young Bonnabelle freshly emerged from the Mother Gum alongside her brother Nettie, alone in the ruins with nobody to call family, made herself some. She created three candy people specifically to fill that role: Aunt Lolly, Cousin Chikel, and Uncle Gumbald. For a while, according to the flashback, they lived together happily in a small settlement called Candy Town that the four of them built with their own hands. It's a genuinely lovely piece of world building once you sit with what it actually means. Princess Bubblegum, the character the rest of the show usually presents as brilliant, controlled, occasionally cold, began her entire adult life as a child alone in rubble who solved the unbearable problem of loneliness, the only way available to her, which was invention. She built herself an uncle. She built herself an aunt and a cousin. She built herself a family out of raw candy matter because the actual family that should have existed didn't survive whatever came before. It didn't stay simple. Gumbald began developing ambitions of his own, chopping down the settlement's taffy trees to build himself a cabin, and later scheming to construct an entire candy city, a plan Bonnabelle undercut by flooding the intended building site with a butterscotch lake overnight. That act of sabotage, however practical, curdled whatever affection Gumbald had held for his creator into something closer to resentment, and the resentment escalated until Gumbald, Chikel, and Lolly were conspiring together in secret to dose Bonnabelle with something called dum-dum juice, a chemical that reduces its target to a simple, docile, happy-go-lucky state, the same fate Gumbald had apparently already arranged for another candy person he'd built specifically to distract Bonnabelle as a boyfriend, a character called Mr. Cream Puff. When Bonnabelle confronted Gumbald about the plot directly, he tried to dose her himself and threatened to do the same to her brother, Nettie. And Bonnabelle, in self-defense, shattered the flask of dum-dum juice against him instead, transforming her own uncle, the family member she'd built out of loneliness, into a permanently simple-minded candy person known from that point on as Punchbowl. Here is the detail that I think turns this entire backstory from a simple villain origin into something genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Bonnabelle didn't view what she'd done as a punishment she regretted. According to the show's own account, she came to believe her transformed relatives seemed happier in their simplified state than they had been as complicated, ambitious, occasionally treacherous individuals, and she used that same dum-dum juice deliberately, going forward, to create the entire population of what would become the Candy Kingdom, an entire society of subjects built specifically to be simple and content, and not incidentally easy to control and impossible to betray her. The kindly, brilliant princess ruling over a joyful candy population is also, when you trace the origin all the way back, a person who responded to the trauma of family betrayal by permanently, chemically simplifying every family and every citizen she would ever create afterward, on purpose, as policy. The show doesn't editorialize on this the way I might be tempted to here. It simply lays the sequence of events out and lets you feel the shape of what it implies about a character it otherwise treats as heroic. Gumbald didn't stay Punchbowl forever. Centuries later, following the chaos of the Elements miniseries and the restoration of Ooh afterward, he's somehow restored to his original, intelligent, resentful self, and by the time the final season begins, he's built an entire rival candy city. Gumbaldia gathered a coalition of Finn and Jake's old enemies to his side, resurrected Fern as a weapon, specifically to break Finn on his 17th birthday, and set himself and Princess Bubblegum on a direct collision course toward open war. The four-part series finale, Come Along With Me, frames this entire conflict, titled by the show and by fans alike as the Great Gum War, through the eyes of two entirely new characters watching it from 1,000 years in the future. Shermie and a girl named Beth, who the show establishes as a descendant of Jake and Lady Rainicorn, discovering a rusted mechanical arm, once Finn's, and tracking down the current king of Oo to learn its history. That king turns out to be BMO, still alive, still functioning, 1,000 years later, having apparently outlasted everyone, and it's BMO who narrates the entire war to these two strangers as a piece of ancient legend, which is a genuinely strange and moving structural choice for a finale to make, telling its own climax as a bedtime story, recounted by the one character who never seemed built for cosmic significance and ended up being the one who survived it all. The war very nearly doesn't happen through violence at all. As the two armies prepare for open battle, Marceline, who lived through the actual Mushroom War herself, pleads directly with Bubblegum to reconsider. But Bubblegum, resolute, sounds the war horn anyway. It's Finn who manages to buy one final chance for peace, convincing Bubblegum to offer Gumbald a genuine opportunity to surrender by reminding her of an old friend named Shoko, and when that last diplomatic attempt collapses anyway, Jake makes a desperate, almost absurd final gambit, throwing a vial of nightmare juice, a substance gifted to him and Finn earlier by a character called Nightmare Princess, which knocks himself, Finn, Bubblegum, Gumbald, and Fern all into a shared hallucinatory sleep together. It is inside that shared dream, not on any battlefield, that the actual emotional resolution of the entire war takes place. Bubblegum and Gumbald continue circling each other with real hostility, even unconscious. At one point, Bubblegum attacking with what the show plays, almost too cheekily, as an imaginary love bazooka. But eventually, after Fern's confrontation with the grass demon and his subsequent painful dissolution back in the waking world, Bubblegum finally offers her uncle something that sounds almost like a genuine apology, telling him she's sorry for never fully respecting the vision he had for what the Candy Kingdom and their strange invented family could have been. Gumbald accepts the apology, and then, in a beat the show plays with real bitterness rather than sentimentality, it's revealed almost immediately that the acceptance was entirely fake, a calculated move to lower Bubblegum's guard long enough for him to seize the advantage. He's stopped not by Bubblegum herself, but by Aunt Lolly, who trips him, spilling his own dum-dum solution over him and turning him back into the simple, harmless punch bowl a second time, ending the war not through combat but through one family member's small, decisive betrayal of another. Lolly steps into leadership of Gumbaldia in his place and agrees to genuine peace with her niece. It's a resolution that the writers themselves have acknowledged, in interviews given after the fact, was compressed far more tightly than they would have liked. According to Kent Osborne, Jack Pendarvis, and former background designer Ghost Shrimp, had the show received the additional season the crew had originally hoped for, Gumbald would have received significantly more development, and Aunt Lolly and Cousin Scheichel would have been given the chance to become the fully realized characters they were clearly designed to be, rather than the somewhat thinner versions the cancellation ultimately left the audience with. That is a genuinely honest piece of context worth sitting with, an admission from the people who made the thing that its ending, However beloved it became is also a compromise, a story finished under real constraint, rather than a perfectly unfurled master plan. And then, in the same finale, in the very same handful of minutes, the show pivots entirely, because the resolution of the Gum War turns out to only be the first half of what's coming. Normal Man and Betty arrive, and it's revealed that Betty, still pursuing her 1,000-year mission to restore Simon, has accidentally set in motion the summoning of Golb, the chaos entity that sits above even the Lich in this show's cosmology. And the entire war we just watched resolve becomes, almost instantly, a footnote against something vastly larger and stranger, threatening to erase Ooh altogether. It's a genuinely audacious structural choice for a finale, spending half its runtime on one war, only to reveal that the actual climax was waiting behind it the entire time. And it works, according to the overwhelming critical and fan consensus that's built up around this finale in the years since, specifically because the show had spent so many years training its audience to trust that everything eventually connects. The difference between Golb and every other cosmic threat this show had built up across its run is worth naming precisely because it's not simply a bigger, badder version of the Lich. The Lich, terrifying as he is at least a being with a purpose, a will, an intention, a scholar devoted to the extinction of all life as an act of devotion to something he believes in. He waits. He plans. He can be reasoned with, however coldly, because he wants something specific and pursues it with something resembling patience. Golb is described by the characters who understand him best, Simon and Bubblegum among them, as chaos and discord in something closer to a pure, agendaless state, an outside context problem that doesn't scheme or wait or want anything in particular. That simply is, the way weather is, the way entropy is, and that unmaking happens to things caught inside it, regardless of whether they deserve it or fought hard enough or figured out the right incantation in time. Once Golb arrives, the battlefield stops being a war between two sides with grievances and becomes something closer to a natural disaster that everyone, heroes and villains and bystanders alike, has to survive together or not at all. Gumbald's own recruited army, the show notes plainly, mostly runs the moment Golb appears. Old villains from a decade of episodes choosing self-preservation over loyalty to any cause. And it's left to a much smaller, much stranger coalition. Aunt Lolly, a newly redeemed Fern, a bewildered but willing Ice King, and Gunter, to actually stand and fight alongside Finn's side once the real threat shows itself. Inside the chaos of that final battle, several of the show's longest-running threads get resolved almost simultaneously, stacked on top of each other, the way only a finale under real-time pressure can afford to stack them. Marceline, believing for a moment that Bubblegum has been killed by one of Golb's mutated creatures, transforms into a monstrous, ram-headed cloud form, the same shape she briefly took during her confrontation with the Vampire King back in Stakes, and tears the creature apart in a burst of grief-fueled violence the show doesn't shy away from. When she finds Bubblegum alive, protected by her own armor, the two of them finally say out loud what the show had spent years only implying, Marceline admitting she never wants to lose her again, and they kiss, plainly, without ambiguity, in the middle of a battlefield. Inside Golb's own body, which the show renders less as a monster and more as a churning, unmaking void that strips whatever enters it down into simplified, essential versions of itself, Simon and Betty are dissolved back to their most basic forms, and it's here stripped of the crown's magic entirely for the first time in 1,000 years, that Simon becomes simply Simon Petrikov again, an old man, powerless, human, and Betty becomes simply herself, and, for one unguarded moment, the two of them are reunited, exactly as they were before any of this began, before a crown from a dock worker in Scandinavia ever entered either of their lives. It doesn't last. Betty makes the choice, alone, without asking him, to fuse her own consciousness with Golb itself, using her wish to reshape the chaos entity into a calmer, less destructive form the show calls Golbetti, a sacrifice that saves Oo and permanently removes her from Simon's life at the exact moment he finally has himself back to give her. Bimo gets a moment in this battle too, one that the show plays with genuine weight rather than comic relief. When one of Golb's creatures destroys the tree fort and appears to have swallowed Finn along with Betty and the Ice King, Jake, left alone and reduced by grief and fear back to a smaller, more vulnerable size, is comforted by BMO, who tells him, gently, that it's their turn to be the parent for once, and sings the same lullaby BMO has sung to Jake before, a song called Time Adventure, written for the occasion by Rebecca Sugar, in one more return visit from an artist who kept coming back to this world, even after building an entire acclaimed show of her own elsewhere. Because Golb is chaos and BMO's song is, in the most literal possible sense, harmony, the music itself becomes a weapon, hurting the creatures around them, and as every surviving inhabitant of Oo joins in, the combined sound buys enough time to save Finn and the newly restored Simon and turn the tide of the entire battle. A small robot singing a lullaby to a frightened dog turns out to be one of the decisive moments in the final battle for the survival of the world. That is, I think, as concise a summary of this show's values as you could ask for. There is a small, quiet detail buried in the finale's production trivia that I want to end this particular layer on, because it feels like the whole show in miniature. The crack that's visible in Simon Petrikov's glasses throughout the entire finale, an object fans had speculated about for years, assuming it must be some scar from the Mushroom War itself, some piece of physical evidence of the catastrophe that started everything, is revealed in the finale to have a far smaller, far more human origin. It happened because Betty, at some point in their life together, before any of this began, threw a jar of cherries at him. That's it. Not a bomb. Not a war. A woman throwing cherries at her fiancé, hard enough to crack his glasses, sometime during an ordinary, unremembered argument or joke between two people who loved each other, 1,000 years before either of them would understand what they were about to lose. The show let an entire fandom assume, for years, that even the smallest physical detail on a character's face must be connected to the great historical trauma at the center of everything. And then, almost as a parting gift, it revealed that sometimes a crack is just a crack, left behind by an ordinary domestic moment between two people who had no idea what was coming, the kind of small, imperfect detail two people in love leave on each other without ever meaning it to become permanent. Given everything else this show does with its glasses and its cracks and its scars, I don't think that reveal is an accident. I think it's the show, in its very last hours, reminding you that not every wound in this world traces back to the apocalypse. Some of them are just what happens when you let someone close enough to throw cherries at you. We've gone through 3 miniseries, a resurrection of family betrayal, and a boy made of grass who chose to end himself rather than remain the version of a person that a curse had built. What connects all of it, Underneath the surface differences of vampires and elemental magic and candy politics is the same question this show has been circling since the very first episode about businessmen frozen in ice, which is what a person or a place or a family actually owes to the version of itself that came before and what it's allowed to become instead. Marceline had to decide whether being a vampire was a curse or simply a fact of who she now was, worth living inside honestly rather than escaping. Ben's mother had to decide whether protecting people meant keeping them permanently contained or finally trusting them with the risk of an open world. Bubblegum had to reckon, at the very end, with the specific cost of having built her entire family and her entire kingdom out of a child's desperate need to not be alone anymore. And Fern had to decide, ultimately, that being made rather than born didn't mean his goodbye mattered any less than anyone else's. None of these stories resolve cleanly. Marceline is still a vampire. Founders Island is still mostly closed off from the world, its choice simply expanded rather than eliminated. The Candy Kingdom is still built at its foundation on a chemical designed to keep its population simple and loyal. Fern is gone, permanently. A tree and a sword, the only things left standing where he used to be. Adventure Time was never really in the business of clean resolutions. It was in the business of showing you the actual shape of a cost and then letting you decide, without much editorial help, whether the thing paid for was worth what it took to get there. I keep coming back, turning this over, to the fact that almost none of what we've walked through tonight was planned very far in advance. Pendleton Ward said it himself. The world of this show got built the way a Dungeons and Dragons campaign gets built, one edition at a time, without a master document dictating where any of it was supposed to end up. Gumbold was a single throwaway line in a season 2 episode about a field of taffy trees, and it sat there, dormant, for 6 years before anyone decided it needed to mean something. Fern was a pun a fictional wizard made about a phrase that sounded cool. Susan Strong existed for most of the show's run as an open question the writers hadn't decided how to answer yet. And BMO, a small toy given almost no cosmic weight anywhere in the show's own internal mythology, ended up being the one character left standing to actually tell the story of how it all ended, because somebody, at some point, presumably in a writer's room working against a real deadline with a real cancellation looming over them, I thought it would be more interesting that way. None of this was fate in any grand, authored sense. It was a group of tired, talented people making the best choice available to them in the room they happened to be in that week, over and over, for 8 years, and somehow the sum of all those small, individual choices adds up to something that feels, watching it end to end, like it was inevitable the whole time. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's actually inevitability either. I think it's just what happens when the people making something care enough, consistently enough, for long enough, that even their throwaway lines eventually earn the weight of prophecy in retrospect. There's a version of this whole show's argument that I think gets clearer the longer you spend down here in its later, less visited corners, away from the parts everybody already knows by heart. It's an argument about inheritance in the broadest possible sense of that word, not just inheritance of a crown or a kingdom or a name, though the show has plenty of that too, but inheritance of the unresolved parts of the people who came before you. Finn inherits his mother's compulsive drive to help people and his father's compulsive tendency to wander off from the people who need him, and has to spend an entire adolescence figuring out, in real time, which parts of that inheritance he actually wants to keep. Bubblegum inherits nothing from anyone. Technically, having been born from a slab of gum attached to a ceiling in a ruined building with no family at all. And so she builds her own inheritance from scratch, deliberately, and then spends the rest of her life discovering that a family you engineer yourself can hurt you just as badly as one you were born into, sometimes for the exact same reasons. Marceline inherits her father's demon blood and a human mother she barely remembers, and 1,000 years of nobody else living long enough to remember anything alongside her, and she turns that inheritance into music instead of despair, most of the time, though the show is honest that most of the time isn't all of the time. And Shermie and Beth, standing at the very end of everything, inherit a sword grown out of a tree, grown out of a boy who was made rather than born, a boy whose entire existence started as an accident and ended as a sacrifice, and they don't know any of that history when they pick that sword up. They just know it feels right in their hands, the same way it apparently felt right in the hands of everyone who held it before them, all the way back to a small blue arm side, a broken blade nobody remembers buying for $3 anymore. That's the actual shape of what survives, I think, once you've gone all the way down through the miniseries and the wars and the vampires and the elemental gods and the family built out of loneliness and betrayal. Not facts. Facts get lost. The way BMO loses Finn's actual name after 1,000 years of otherwise perfect mechanical memory. What survives is something closer to disposition, a kind of inherited orientation toward the world that keeps getting passed down through whatever vessel happens to be available, whether that vessel is a biological child, an invented uncle, a grass clone with someone else's memories, or a small robot who decided, somewhere along the way, that being loved by two brothers was worth building an entire identity around. The show never states this as a thesis. It never has a character stand up and explain the theme out loud, because that has never been how this show works. It just keeps showing you the same underlying shape, patiently, from a dozen different angles, across a decade of episodes and 3 miniseries, and one very long final battle against a god of pure chaos, and trusts that if it shows you enough angles of the same true thing, you'll eventually recognize it without needing to be told. The show ends, ultimately, the way it always tended to end things, gently, with a passing of something forward rather than a closing of a door. 2 new kids find an old sword in a tree grown from a boy who was never quite the original but mattered anyway, and they pose the way heroes posed before them, and somewhere off in the story we didn't get to see, presumably, they go have adventures of their own. The land of Ooh keeps going. It was always going to keep going, long after the specific people we spent 10 years loving stopped being the ones telling its story, long after the specific writers who built it moved on to their own new projects, long after the network that canceled it and the network that eventually gave it a handful of specials afterward both made their own separate peace with what the show had turned out to be. 1,000 years is a long time in universe. It is also, not coincidentally, roughly how long it can feel, some nights, since you first found this show yourself, whenever that was, however many years or however many rewatches ago, back when it was just a boy and his dog and a joke about businessmen frozen in a lake, before you had any idea how far down it actually went. If any of this found its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine while I put it together, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you left a like on this video and considered subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you'd think, and it means these deep, slow, unhurried explorations get to keep happening, one buried layer at a time, the same patient way this show built its own world. Thank you for spending this much time in the dark with me tonight. Listening to a cartoon talk about grief and family and inheritance and what actually survives once the facts themselves are gone. Rest well. The adventure continues somewhere, whether we're watching or not.